Okay, in this video, we're going to build upon what we have before. We're going to dynamically populate an array. Populate, he says, mistyping it, miswriting it, populate an array. Okay, so there are a couple of really crucial concepts here that you need to be aware of. When you do such a thing, there are two things you need to establish if you're going to dynamically. The size of the array. You need a mechanism to determine how big it's going to be. You haven't got a static collection of values. You need to set out what is the size, and then you need a mechanism to add a value to the array. And this mechanism needs to be repeated. So whatever mechanism you use to add the values, so you grab a value, it could be from a user, it could be from a file, but this has to be repeated, this code. So however many values you have based on the size, you have to populate it in that particular way. Right, so what we're going to do is go through the actual coding procedure and discuss the code as we do it and the syntax. Now, it's quite important we take a simple example from before. That was the example used in the previous lecture. That we no longer need because we are going to do that dynamically. So I'm going to pop that down and open some space up inside here. So the very first thing, as I said, is to work out the size. But to get the size, I need some way. I need a way to grab the values from whichever source is going to supply me. It could be a file, it could be a database, it could be lots of different sources. We're going to grab it from a user through the console. And as we've introduced the scanner, we're going to grab a scanner object, and I'm going to call it scanner input. It's going to be a new scanner. Inside here, we pop in the phrase system.in, and tab 9 very helpfully just helps me complete. Now that's the object, the input. This is the object that allows me to grab data from the console. Now, if I want to ask for the size, I need to say, please. So let's use our homemade print statement. Put a bit of thing, says, please enter size of array. And if you remember, the advantage of using this print statement, which was a helper function, if you can't remember that, go back to the previous video and watch me build it. So you enter, that saves, that is my homemade helper function, and it saves me having to write systemout.println every time, makes my code a lot simpler. So now I want to grab it and I want to store it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to declare a variable. I'm going to call it size, and I'm going to, from the input object, so I'm going to use my input scanner object. If I press dot, it helpfully pops open. Now tab 9 very cleverly knows that I am, well, does it? That's a good question. Does it know that I'm trying to get an integer, but it seems to have raised that to the top? Well, it does. If you look at it, if I'm going to pass it an integer, then obviously I want to get an integer. So tab 9 is a clever little piece of software, tells me which piece or what I need to do. So that line is required to go grab it, stores the size inside here. Now what we have to do is build an empty array, right? Now you might say to yourself, why do we have to be so complicated? Ask yourself the question you do not always know up front, depending on the type of scenario, what type of situation you're in. And if you've got tab 9 operating, it will actually help you build the code. So what we're doing is this line here. We are declaring it, but we are going to, I'm going to click on it and close the bracket and talk you through how this line of code actually works, because there's a word in here that has appeared several times. Whenever we see the word new, we are creating a new object. So let's just be absolutely clear about this. When I write int with the square bracket indicating it's an array, whatever the name is, we're not really worried in this video, in this writing. I use the new keyword, and then I say it's a new integer, and then I put brackets here for the size I want to put in here. That new keyword is critical. What it actually means and what it does under the cover is it creates an object. So what it does is that an array is not a simple piece of information, a single value, because it's multiple value. Actually, we treat the array as an object. We need the new keyword to create a new empty one. So that line of code essentially creates an empty array. That's what that's done off that length. So if I put 20, if I put 30, that's the size it would be. We now want to populate it. This is where it gets quite interesting. Now, what you will notice is that down here I've got a loop which uses the length of the array to loop, right? What you're going to find a lot with this is that you can reuse basically the same logic. If I grab that, paste that up here, and redo that bracket, I now have created a loop using the same concept as we were doing to output it. But this loop starts with an index value. As long as it's up to the length of the array, notice I'm asking the array once I've created it, and actually I should really call it int array. Let's just keep our names consistent. Okay, and get rid of that. Okay, so that name is consistent, that name and that name. Right, so build an empty one. It's now an empty one of a certain length. Okay, there is something there, but it's empty. A very critical concept between empty and there being no object. I'll come back to that much later. I use the same logic of the loop, and now what I'm going to say is, with my helper function, please enter an integer. Okay. Then I'm going to ask for that integer. Now what I'm going to do is just create a temporary variable to grab that integer. Notice tab 9 knows that it's an integer because I'm declared that as an integer. So there we go. That's going to grab a line of code. Then I want to pop it into, add it to my array. Now what I don't want to do is just add it randomly. I can't just simply do this. Let's actually flip very quickly to the paper here just to make it clear. Right, I want to add a value. Let's say I grab a value, right? And the value is say 3, and I want to add it to my integer array. My integer array, let's say it's like that. It's all empty. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the size is 5. Okay, 5 places for me to put data. I can't simply, and that's called int array. Okay, I cannot simply say int array equals temp. So I can't simply take my individual value and make it equal the array and assume it's going to slot it into the right place. To slot it into the right place, I have to tell it where to put it. Now, if you remember from lists, each position has what's called an index position, right? Notice 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. If the length is 5, the maximum index position is 1 less, and it always starts with an index position of 0. So I have to basically tell it by using a square bracket where I'm going to put it. So what value is going to go in here? What number am I going to put in here? Because if I've got if I'm asking for a length of an array, it could be 500, it could be 20. I clearly can't put any solid number. I have to have a variable to help me control this. And that's exactly what I'm doing over here. That index value is the variable. So I get int array. I open my square bracket. I use the index and I hand it temp, my value that I've just got from the user. So using that index position, which is from the loop, that's what it's going to do. Now, I know for a fact that, and past experience, that is quite a tricky set of concepts to get hold of. But for the time being, we're going to just leave it at that. You're going to code it and then you're going to test it. We no longer need that line of code, right? as we say, because we've now, from a length, created an empty one, we've populated it. The rest of our code should just display whatever we've populated. So let's test it out and see where the errors are, where the concepts don't quite make sense. There is something that we haven't closed. Hang on a second. What is it? Not right. Yes, I've used a single speech mark here. I should have used a double speech mark. Right, that's what it's saying. Let's click on that and run it. Please enter size of array. Let's keep it nice and simple. Let's make it 5. Please enter an integer. So I'm going to keep this simple. I'm going to put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And there's my code running 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's run it again. Let's say that we put in 3 and the values are 300, that 1, 1, 1, 1, and let's have a random selection. And there we go. Through that output loop, it's displayed it. You might want to look at the lecture notes and make that print statement a little bit clearer. Because you've got an index value, you can say it's the first, it's the second, it's the third value. Have a look at how that code works. But that's how these two pieces here and this whole process is how you go about dynamically building an array, a simple mechanism.